Every October, Americans rake leaves into piles, drag branches to the curb, and light bonfires that destroy what could become decades of free water and free fertilizer. We call it yard waste. We pay to have it removed. And then, in spring, we drive to a garden center and spend $60, $80, $100 replacing exactly what we just burned. Water, nutrients, organic matter, gone in an afternoon bonfire, purchased back the following weekend in bags. This is not an accident. It is a cycle. And like every cycle that costs someone money every season, there are people with a direct financial interest in making sure it never occurs to you to question it. Meanwhile, in the Austrian Alps, at 1,500 meters elevation, where winter temperatures drop to minus 25 degrees Celsius and snow covers the ground for half the year, one farmer buried that same yard waste and grew lemons. Not in a greenhouse, not with irrigation. Lemons hanging heavy on trees planted in mounds of rotting wood, fruiting through winter while his neighbors struggled to grow grass. For over 20 years, his beds produced harvests that should have been impossible, watering themselves through droughts that emptied wells across the valley. Then the government tried to destroy him. They fined him dozens of times. They threatened to seize his land. They deployed every bureaucratic mechanism available to make him stop. And when scientists finally studied what he built, they found something that challenges the foundational assumptions of modern commercial agriculture. This is that story. And this is the question it forces. Who benefits from a world where we burn what feeds us and buy back what we just destroyed? If you are new here, subscribe right now. Roots Conspiracy investigates agricultural methods that were labeled myths, buried by industry, or quietly erased from the mainstream, and finds out who benefits from keeping them that way. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The next investigation is already in production. Start with what the modern system actually requires from you. The average American household spends between $400 and $800 per year on lawn and garden inputs, fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation equipment, potting mix, soil amendments, products that are used once, depleted in a single season, and must be purchased again the following spring without exception. The global fertilizer market alone is worth over $200 billion annually. The pesticide market adds $60 billion more. Both depend on the same structural requirement. The soil must stay hungry. The gardener must stay dependent. The purchase cycle must repeat. 1.7 billion tons of American topsoil are lost every year to erosion and degradation. $69 billion are spent annually on agricultural chemicals to compensate for what that lost soil used to provide for free. Groundwater is depleting across the country as irrigation demand climbs every decade. The system is not feeding people more efficiently. It is feeding itself, and it requires, as a condition of its continued existence, that you never discover what was buried before it arrived, that you never question why the branches in your yard are waste when the forest treats the same material as its primary investment, that you never ask what the soil was doing before someone started selling you a substitute for it. What Sepp Holzer built in the Austrian Alps was not a gardening experiment. It was a direct refutation of every dependency that system requires. Holzer inherited his family's failing farm in 1962 at age 19. The property sat on the southern slope of Schwarzenberg Mountain in Salzburg province, a place later described by visiting scientist Dr. Bernd Loch as Austria's Siberia. 170 frost days per year. Ice days where temperatures never climbed above freezing. Winds that stripped topsoil from exposed slopes. His father had followed every regulation, planted the government-approved spruce monocultures, pruned the fruit trees according to the manual, and died leaving the farm buried in debt. Holzer looked at those rules and saw only failure. He looked at the forest and saw abundance. Nobody was watering it. Nobody was fertilizing it. Nobody was managing it. And it produced more life per square meter than any regulated farm in the region. So he stopped following the rules and started following the forest. He buried logs. He built terraced mounds from dead wood and planted directly into them. He dug ponds without permits. He let his fruit trees grow unpruned, discovering that unpruned branches bent under snow loads, while pruned ones snapped like kindling. He planted citrus where regulations demanded spruce. The Austrian Agricultural Board responded with fines, then more fines, then threats of land seizure. By the late 1980s, Sepp Holzer was known throughout Austria as the most fined farmer in the country. His crime, producing 10 times more food per hectare than any neighbor following the official regulations, without irrigation, without fertilizer, without the chemicals that filled government warehouses. When the Agricultural Board finally threatened to seize his farm entirely, Holzer's response was simple. He invited them to walk the terraces, taste the lemons that had never seen a greenhouse, measure the harvests, stand in front of the evidence and explain, using any agricultural framework they had available, why the numbers were impossible. They could not. They came with clipboards and cameras. They photographed kiwi vines climbing alongside spruce trees. They watched Holzer pull radishes from snow-covered beds in December, the soil beneath still warm from decomposing wood. They had no category for what they were seeing. By 1995, Professor Lach and students from Vienna's Boco University officially certified Krameterhof as the most consistent example of permaculture worldwide. In 2002, Holzer published his book, and it became a bestseller. Today, he consults on every continent, teaching what the Austrian government spent decades trying to bury. At the center of everything he built is one principle: rotting wood is not waste, it is infrastructure. Here is the mechanism, documented in peer-reviewed research and replicated across climate zones. Wood, buried underground, begins to decompose. As it breaks down, the cell walls, made primarily of lignin and cellulose, are consumed by fungi and bacteria. The pathways inside the wood open wider. Water floods in, filling every chamber. Laboratory measurements show heavily decomposed pine logs absorbing water equal to 5 times their dry weight, 500% moisture content. Oak breaks down more slowly but still doubles or triples its mass with absorbed water. A study from Western Kentucky University measured Hügelkultur sites over 3 months and found they contained almost twice as much water as flat control plots. A full hectare of these mounds can hold 3 to 10 times more water than equivalent flat ground. The Goleta Water District in California demonstrated a 40% reduction in irrigation needs compared to traditional raised beds. Practitioners from Oregon to Massachusetts report that after 2 to 3 years, mature beds require 0 supplemental irrigation during normal rainfall. 0. The hose stays in the shed all summer. The decomposition process also generates heat. Microbes and fungi consuming the buried wood produce thermal energy as a metabolic byproduct. Cornell University composting research documents organic decomposition reaching temperatures between 104 and 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Fresh Hügelkultur beds have been measured at 140 degrees initially, maintaining 85 degrees while surrounding ground soil holds 70. That 15-degree advantage extends growing seasons by weeks in cold climates. Seeds germinate earlier. Late frosts pass harmlessly over warm mounds, while killing plants in conventional beds feed away. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, gardeners are planting tomatoes 2 weeks earlier and harvesting squash into November. The most rigorous proof came from a 3-year USDA-funded study at Bug Hill Farm in Ashfield, Massachusetts. Researchers built Hügelkultur beds and traditional control beds side by side and measured everything. After 3 years, elderberry plants in the Hügelkultur beds produced 147% more stems, and plants that grew 141% taller than controls. The soil health index improved by 7.67% versus 4.67% in traditional beds. This was not a marginal difference. This was not within the margin of error. This was a complete transformation of productivity, measured and documented by scientists with a federal grant. And the fertility compounds over time. The wood begins with a carbon-to-nitrogen ratio that temporarily draws nitrogen from surrounding soil, the first-year challenge that beginners encounter. But research tracking wood decomposition over 15 years shows that ratio dropping from as high as 829 to 1 down to 16 to 1 at advanced decay stages. What starts as a nitrogen consumer transforms into a nitrogen bank, releasing steady supplies for decades. The system does not deplete, it builds. Every year, the bed gets richer, not poorer. Every year, the irrigation demand drops. Every year, the inputs required approach zero. This is the direct opposite of every dynamic the commercial agriculture industry depends on. So why isn't it standard practice? Why does the average gardener spend $800 a year on inputs instead of burying the branches they already have? The answer is not that the method failed. The method was never tested and found wanting. It was displaced by something faster, and the speed was optimized for profit, not for soil. In the decades after 1920, tractors and combine harvesters changed the physical requirements of farming. These machines demanded flat surfaces, no mounds, no terraces, nothing that could slow a steel wheel or jam a mechanical plow. Efficiency was redefined as acres covered per hour, not fertility maintained per decade. Fields were scraped level. Brush was burned instead of buried. The landscape was reworked to serve machines, not roots. The buried wood method did not fail. It did not fit. And what did not fit the new machine logic was systematically abandoned, not because anyone studied it and found it inferior, but because it was incompatible with the business model that mechanized agriculture was building around itself. The soil that had been fed by buried organic matter for generations now needed to be fed by purchased inputs. Synthetic nitrogen replaced the slow release of decomposing wood. Irrigation systems replaced the moisture reservoir of buried logs. Pesticides replaced the biological diversity that mounded soil had nurtured. Each solution was sold. Each required repeat purchase. Each created a new dependency that reinforced the one before it. And each was presented not as a business decision, but as a scientific advancement, the language of progress wrapped around what was, structurally, the conversion of free natural fertility into a recurring revenue stream. And every farmer who might have questioned this was told the same thing. This is progress. The old ways are inefficient. Science has given us better tools. The science that was never cited was the science of what was lost. The science of what decomposing wood does to water retention. The science of what buried organic matter does to soil temperature. The science of what a living fungal network does to nutrient availability over decades. That science existed. It simply was not funded, not amplified, and not taught at the agricultural universities whose extension programs were built in partnership with the input industry. Now ask who loses when this continues. The answer is specific, and the numbers are not abstract. The American gardener who spends $800 annually on inputs over 30 years of gardening spends $24,000 buying back fertility that rotting wood would have provided for free. Over a lifetime of food gardening, the compounded cost is staggering, not just in dollars, but in water, in plastic packaging, in the chemical load introduced into soil that should be a living ecosystem. The farmer operating on thin margins who cannot afford to let a field rest or build long-term fertility loses every year to input costs that compound like debt. American farm bankruptcies have climbed for years while input costs have risen faster than commodity prices. The system extracts from the land and from the farmer simultaneously. The communities in drought-prone regions, the American Southwest, the High Plains, the increasingly dry stretches of the Midwest, who are depleting aquifers to irrigate soil that buried wood would keep moist without any pumping. And beyond individual economics, there is a civilizational loss that the numbers do not fully capture. In 1542, Spanish conquistador Francisco de Orellana sailed the Amazon and reported cities with millions of inhabitants, organized agriculture, and infrastructure that rivaled Europe. Later explorers found only jungle. Historians dismissed his accounts for 4 centuries. Then soil scientists discovered terra preta, black earth 2,000 years old, still fertile, self-regenerating at roughly 1 centimeter per year. These soils supported populations of 10 to 20 million people in cities larger than contemporary London. The indigenous communities who created it were using the same principle Holzer rediscovered: burying organic carbon builds, soil that does not deplete. Today, those archaeological sites are being mined for potting soil and bulldozed for development. Hundreds of sites are being destroyed as you read this. We are literally excavating and selling the soil-building wisdom of civilizations that fed millions for centuries, packaging it in plastic bags with a premium price sticker, and replacing the practice that created it with bagged substrate from a garden center that will compact and deplete after a single season. For 5,000 years, Native American communities planted corn, beans, and squash together in mounds. The Three Sisters system fed Cahokia, a city of 100,000 people near modern St. Louis, larger than London in its time. The 1887 Allotment Act systematically dismantled this agricultural knowledge base. Universities are now spending millions in grant funding to rediscover, in controlled laboratory conditions, what traditional ecological knowledge never forgot. We erased it. We are paying to reconstruct it, and the reconstruction will be sold back to us as a product. The pattern is not coincidental. It is structural. The most effective agricultural knowledge tends to be the knowledge that cannot be commodified, the knowledge that says, bury this, let it rot, come back in 3 years and find something better than anything you could buy. That knowledge does not generate revenue. It does not produce a SKU. It cannot be placed on a shelf with a margin attached. So it does not get amplified. So it does not get funded. So it does not get taught in the agricultural programs whose budgets depend on industry partnerships. And so most people never learn it exists, not because it was hidden in a vault, but because the information infrastructure that shapes what you know was built by people who needed you to keep buying. The implication is not comfortable. If buried wood produces twice the water retention of conventional beds, documented. If it generates heat that extends growing seasons, documented. If it builds soil fertility instead of depleting it, documented across a 3-year federal study. If it reduces irrigation needs to zero in mature beds, documented by practitioners in every climate zone from Los Angeles to Minnesota. And if this knowledge was available to the agricultural establishment at the same time the machine agriculture system was being constructed, then the decision to abandon it was not ignorance. It was economics. The buried wood method produces outcomes that are incompatible with a $200 billion annual fertilizer market, incompatible with a $60 billion pesticide market, incompatible with the infrastructure of garden centers, irrigation suppliers, and soil amendment manufacturers that have built their businesses on the assumption that your soil will always need something it cannot provide for itself. Sepp Holzer was fined not because his farm was dangerous. He was fined because it was proof. Proof that the dependency was not necessary. Proof that the inputs were not required. Proof that 10 times the yield was achievable without a single purchased product. A farm that disproves the foundational premise of a $200 billion industry is not an agricultural anomaly. It is a threat, and the regulatory apparatus that spent decades trying to shut it down was not protecting the public. It was protecting the market. The Austrian government eventually stopped threatening to seize his land. But the industry that depends on you never learning what he built is still operating, still amplified, still the default answer when you search for how to grow better tomatoes. Every October, you will have a choice. Burn it or bury it. Spend the following spring buying back what you just destroyed, or plant into what you saved. The branches at the curb are not waste. They are the inputs you are about to purchase. The only difference is whether you understand that before or after the transaction. The science is settled. The data exists. The only remaining question is the one this channel asks every episode. Who decided you shouldn't know this? And what do they gain from you continuing not to? Subscribe. And I mean right now. What this episode documented is one method with a suppressed paper trail, a farmer who was fined for proving it worked, a federal study that confirmed the yields, and an industry with 200 billion annual reasons to make sure the conversation stays pointed somewhere else. Somewhere more profitable. Somewhere that ends at a checkout counter instead of at a pile of branches in your own backyard. There are more methods with the same pattern: documented, effective, impossible to sell, systematically deprioritized. We investigate them one by one with the same question every time. Who decided this doesn't work? And what did they gain from you believing that? If that question matters to you, subscribe. Turn on notifications. Share this with someone who spent $60 on fertilizer last spring and has a pile of branches sitting at the curb right now. Drop a comment. Are you building a bed this season? What wood do you have access to? And has anyone in your local gardening community ever mentioned this method? Or does it only show up in places the mainstream algorithm never recommended? I read every single one. The next investigation is already in production. You do not want to miss it.